Welcome to another episode of the Carry Trainer Higher Line podcast. Hey guys, welcome to yet another episode of the Higher Line podcast. We've got a special guest as usual. They're all special. But this one's super special. Young Catalina Lauf. You are running for U.S. Congress. We had you on about a year ago. And you have been continuing to fight to try to get your message out to the public. Welcome back. What's going on since the last time we saw you a year ago?
Oh man, I think it was 2 years ago now.
Okay, 2 years. Time flies.
Time does fly. We ended up losing that primary, as you know, because you're local here, by just a little bit. And then ultimately, whoever won that primary was the older gentleman. And he lost the seat to the incumbent or was not able to flip it. So, which was unfortunate. It's a very Republican area. So we're back at it again this time. We have a great shot. After the Illinois redistricting, they actually made this particular gentleman, Bill Foster, who's the incumbent Democrat now, very vulnerable to try to appease all these other Cook County incumbent Democrats towards more the city. And so out here in the suburbs, it's very Republican. We have a great shot at flipping it. It's actually on one of the watch lists recently, and they're going to fight for it, but we're going to fight harder and we're going to flip it. And we are very excited for what's to come.
I dig it. I want to change gears right out of the gate because nobody wants to hear political speak. Nobody, including me. I like everything you just said is awesome. I think you got to have a good attitude going into it. And for folks that don't live in Illinois, we mirror places like New York or New Jersey or places that have big liberal cities that then dictate the pace of the entire state. Well, most of our state is pretty conservative and rural. We've got Chicago politics that kind of dictate everything. And so what I want to talk about, which is what we spoke about before the interview here, is what are you going to do when you're in Congress? Like, why should people vote for you? Why should people care about another person wanting to go to Congress? What are you going to do?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to what people really want nowadays, and what really kind of drove why I wanted to run was just this everyday person, the everyday American who is leaving what they're doing, leaving their everyday lives to go and actually be a servant of the people. We have not had that for decades. You have members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, who have been in there for 30, 40 years. We don't have new faces, new perspective, people on our side that really want to preserve the American dream, preserve what our Constitution stands for, preserve what the Republican ideology stands for, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And nowadays, it's very sad that the Republican Party sometimes doesn't even have a backbone, and we cannot continue to cower to the far left. The Democrat Party today is not the Democrat Party of your grandfather. Like, this is straight up communist ideology that they're pushing, not only from a economic perspective, where state controls the means of production, but also from a cultural perspective. When we see everything that's going on with the culture wars, how politics is now involved in every aspect of our lives. And it's really important that we have younger faces and new perspectives on our side, on the side of freedom, but people who actually want to fight for what's right, who have the courage to stand up, even when it's not exactly what everybody wants to hear, but who can actually push back to this kind of younger generation of these people on the far left that are taking over that party and fight fire with fire. And I'm very confident that not only myself, but other candidates across the country are part of this new kind of patriot revolution, where we are literally everyday American people that just want to preserve the values of our country and fight for our home districts. And that's what we bring, is just kind of that new face, that fighter mentality, but also the servant leadership quality.
What are some of the topics that you're talking about? So we work a lot in generalities, right? When we think of politics, us versus them.
Yeah.
What what are some of the points, like if you had to list out 2 or 3 or 4 things that you're talking about?
Number one is preserving individual liberty. Look at what's happened over the last couple years with everything that's going on, not only with the pandemic that we had, but just in general, the president of the United States getting kicked off of Twitter, censorship, things that our First Amendment is directly under attack. Our Second Amendment has, as you would know, absolutely has been under attack for decades. And we need to preserve what the rights that were given to us by our creator, not by a government and not by man. And those are every day being chipped away at. Honestly, it wasn't until I ran for Congress, not only on not necessarily on the First Amendment stuff. I think all of that is really coming up more now, but for the Second Amendment, individual liberties, immigration reform is still one of the highest priorities for actually both people on Republican and Democrat. And we've seen actually just the detriment of over the last 2 years. What Biden and Kamala Harris ran on was literally to incentivize illegal immigration. And we're seeing the effects of rhetoric. Words matter. And when you have 200,000 illegal immigrants crossing the border, our police have been vilified, our border patrol has been vilified. Everything that's going on creates this bottleneck effect that, and we're unfortunately seeing it now bleed into different districts. And people care about that stuff. I mean, even here in Illinois, we're not a border town at all, but we really do want people to come here the right way. We want to encourage productive citizens. We want to encourage people to come here legally that want to learn the language and want to work hard. And unfortunately, we don't have of who's coming to our borders. Think about all the labor trafficking, the sex trafficking, the cartels, the drug trafficking, everything that's happening down there. And yet the Democrats are vilifying the people who are trying to stop that. That's a huge problem. And it's something that's going to continue to be a problem if people on both sides of the aisle don't have a backbone enough to address it and actually create thoughtful, meaningful reform, like putting more resources down there, like creating a border wall. Things like that could happen with thoughtful bipartisanship. And we're not seeing that when our country is so divided right now.
How does somebody create thoughtful bipartisanship when folks can't even communicate, right? How do you create bipartisanship? How can you, let me, before you answer that, what are the people on the other side of the aisle, what are they doing right at all? What is the Democratic Party, the liberal agenda? What are they doing right? I mean, it can't be all wrong, right? Correct?
I would say they're not the party that today that they were 20 years ago. So I wouldn't agree that I don't think they're doing anything right. I think
not a single thing.
Maybe that they stick together. So at least they have that going for them. But in terms of what they're doing for the country, no, we have abysmal economy right now. We have people coming, flooding our borders. We have inflation skyrocketing. I think they're doing everything wrong, which is why we need to replace them.
You can't think of a single thing. I'm just asking. So how about the conservative side of the house? What are they doing right?
They're doing a lot wrong too. So,
right.
Which is, I insert, people like me running here, not just me, but other people across the country. I would say they're trying to fight for our individual liberties. They're trying to continue to be constitutionalists. I think some of them are, and they're trying to push back, but they're not doing it enough. They're not fighting against what's going on right now. They could be doing a lot more. I know that it's incredibly hard when you are in the minority to actually push any sort of legislation when you have constantly somebody standing in your way. Look, I have friends of mine that are working on Capitol Hill, and they will tell you the Democrats refuse to work with Congress on meaningful legislation, period. They won't even, Nancy Pelosi will not even take anybody into consideration. If you're half the time when they go for votes, they don't even have the entire bill or time to read it. I mean, this is the actual sickening things that are going on within the Capitol that the average American doesn't hear about. They just hear people throwing mud at each other, but they actually don't realize what's going on.
So how does a young freshman congressman, congresswoman in this case, pardon me, how do they go into this deeply mechanized system that what often happens is people just fall lockstep, and it's not because people are evil, in my opinion. It's the same reason that everybody's on Facebook, the same reason that people pull into the same fast food restaurants. It's just, it becomes the norm. How does a young congresswoman go in there and do something different? You can't tell Nancy Pelosi what to do, and you can't say you have to listen to me.
Watch me. First of all,
I mean, you can say it, but she doesn't have
look,
to listen to you. I guess that's my point.
she doesn't. But first of all, you can't do anything alone. Okay. I can sit there and be as loud and use my platform and drive change, not only from a policy perspective, but also culturally from the capacity that I can, right?
Okay.
How I can't do anything alone. And it really does take now all these kind of new faces and new perspectives running who do have a backbone, who have proven to go against the grain already just as candidates against the establishment, against these people who are just going to be fall in line type of politicians. But we cannot do it alone, which is why we need to take back the House so that Nancy Pelosi doesn't have any power, so she doesn't have the gavel to block partisan or to block legislation, and together actually push forward. And that's exactly what's going to happen here when we take the House back during these midterms. Is you're going to see people who have already proven themselves to be disruptors, to be servants of the people, who are not afraid to fight and fight together. Because again, you can't do it alone. Not one person can do it alone.
When I asked a question a moment ago about what do you think the Democrats are doing right, I started to think to myself, and there's a couple things that come to mind for me. And the only reason I'm asking this is I like to play devil's advocate because it helps me understand better how to find common ground or
Sure.
form a line of communication. For example, I very much love all of the open spaces that we have protected, wildlands, wetlands, etc., which much of comes through the liberal side of Congress. There's plenty of conservative people that are conservationists as well, but like that comes to mind. It seems like, and this is just my opinion, we need to find more of what we have in common than what we don't, so that we can sit at a table, break bread, communicate, and find a way to move forward. I've always thought even people like Nancy Pelosi think they are doing what is right. And they are, based on the totality of their experiences and what they think the world should look like, which, when you look at it from that perspective, I mean, somebody's going to hear me say that and they're going to be like, that chick's crazy, or these people are lunatics. And that might be, but to them, they think you're a lunatic. And not you, maybe you too. Yeah, you too, for sure.
I would say that there are a lot of areas that we can come together on. I would say the mental health crisis, opioid crisis, veteran healthcare, things like that NAP should come together on. It's just, unfortunately, those things are not being prioritized. To go back to your conservationism, and Republicans and Democrats can come together on things like conservation, like protecting the earth. We all want to protect what we have for the future of our families and things like that. However, when it turns into trillion-dollar Green New Deals and manipulating masses on pushing things like man-made climate change, and then from using that as a mechanism to bet our entire economy on policy changes like that, that for them, it is never enough. There are things that we can come together on. However, at some point, somebody has to be the adult in the room and say, no, we can do these things together. And on top of that, too, the way how manipulative they are is that they will name certain bills and policies. And if a Republican doesn't agree, just for an example, say the Green New Deal was a policy thing that they were trying to push, not the one that they had, but just in general. And there's one little provision in there to say protecting the animal wildlife in Idaho. If that was part of that bill and a Republican didn't want to agree on that bill because of the broader bill and because of all the money being put from a broader perspective, the Democrats will use that one line and then say Republicans don't want to protect animal wildlife in so-and-so Idaho, whatever, and then take that and run with it to the media. And then you don't have enough Republicans who sit there to defend their position and actually say, no, this is why I did not vote for that bill. It had this also in it. Let's do another bill that only has that small provision. Those things are never talked about, but that's the reality. That's the curtain behind the curtain that needs to either be spoken more about. Republicans need to stop going on defense. We need to go more on offense and say, these are the types of positions that I want to come together with Democrats on. However, we've got to meet on these small things before we can even start talking about these big spending packages, for example.
I dig that. I definitely have seen plenty of Republicans cherry pick information like you just stated too, and try to burn down somebody on the other side. I think that's politics and marketing. People do that crap. Why do we have to keep playing party politics? I'm sick of Republicans and Democrats. I'm sick of people towing party lines. I'm sick of party lines really not even being a line, but just some big ambiguous net of ideas that maybe don't even meet a cohesive kind of like worldview. Like it used to be, like you said, my grandfather was a diehard Democrat, except to him that meant help the poor, help single moms, clean up communities. Like that's what it meant to him. And he was in the Navy. He was a hardworking man, died with money in the bank, working as a tradesman. Like it's not at all. I don't think he would much care for what's going on in the world right now, but there was a way of seeing the world that was kind of cohesive. And liberalism used to mean free thought, women's rights, which I think is pretty cool. I mean, a lot of people don't like to look back and think about, we often point to Democrats and say that they were the folks pushing slavery and racism. A lot of the conservative side of the house also was stopping things from like women working and voting and things like that. So there's kind of like things that I think should change. It wasn't really a question, that was a bunch of different thoughts rolling out there, but talk about some of that stuff.
Sure. In terms of the political stuff, I would say the majority of Americans are probably in the same boat. I know I certainly was when deciding to run. The Republican Party, the Mitt Romney, the establishment party of that faction had left me a long time ago. But then also the Democrats became a lot more radical. And so the squad actually kind of runs a lot of what Pelosi says. Why? It all comes down to money, right? You look at these different races all across the country and why there still is a two-party system, because people are naturally going to gravitate. It's just human nature, are naturally going to gravitate towards black and white, one or two. You either want this or you want that. And so it makes it incredibly difficult for, let's say, like a third party or libertarian or whatever to come up and to be able to compete with both of these sides, especially when it comes down to the money. It takes a massive amount of money now.
Mm-hmm.
Each of these, if you could put like a price tag on them, it's to me how much money actually goes into these congressional seats, into Senate races, all because people want to preserve power. Again, on both sides of the aisle. In the last race, just to give you an idea of, I was up against the establishment that had all the money, and we were limited with resources. Why? Because we just didn't have access to that. And so we were actually bought and paid for by $5 and $10. People on Social Security, veterans, farmers, people who gave $5 and $10 were what was fueling our campaign. And so I actually think that this new era of on both sides of the aisle, these new I don't want to say populism, but people are now choosing the right person for the job because they like them and they're bought and paid for by $5 and $10. They're now not, people are not gravitating towards the establishment anymore. And I think that allows new people to come in that are actually more accountable to the regular public instead of kind of towing these party lines, right? So I think that's a way around it, is all the money that's going in, but then also new candidates that are getting more exposure. They're in the digital era. You know, we can, now that we have a platform ourselves, we can raise money own without having to like rely on the entrenchment bigger dollars that most of these established. So I think that's good in the sense of like bridging this divide, is like, in order to be a servant leader, like you are backed by the people. You are not backed by big money, by big corporations, by big lobbying arms, by all these big PACs. You're able to rise up through the everyday common man and woman, right? I think that helps. But unfortunately, it goes back to why we can't have like a third party, right? Because people just naturally gravitate towards one or two, and then they kind of get all the money. So it comes down to, I think, primaries. Like when you are a Republican in a primary, people have more options onto who they have the best person for that job. And the more exposure I think people can get when you're in a primary setting, I think it allows the better person to rise up, right? And again, an example of that is like we almost won against the big money establishment in the first race that we had. And I think if that's located across the country, we're in a really good spot. The same thing is happening for the Democrats. Look at AOC. She might be crazy to a lot of us, but she's actually disrupting her party. And she was able to go up against the big money and all that because that's who the people wanted for their party. All of that to say, back to your grandfather and how this is not the same party that your grandfather would once know, right? Or that even Kennedy would probably be a Republican nowadays in most people's eyes. It is so much more of, look, what united Americans, even back then, was our flag, our values. You would not meet a Democrat, especially like your grandfather, let's say, who was in the Navy. There was a clear sense of patriotism and what our flag symbolized, what our American values were. And so politically, people might have not have agreed on things like Social Security or big spending, and Republicans and Democrats might have disagreed on things like that. But what united us was our values and our flag. Nowadays, you see athletes kneeling, you see Eminem kneeling at the Super Bowl, you see the Pledge of Allegiance being taken out of our public school system. Our fundamental American values that brought us together at some point by being Americans is now under attack. And there's only one side that's doing that. That is the problem. When we're disagreeing on basic things like protecting our freedom of speech, protecting our Second Amendment, kneeling to our flag, when we are disagreeing on what is right and wrong, we have gotten to a point in our country that this is beyond policy. This is beyond just basic one bill passing here and another passing there, immigration reform. We are now at war on our cultural values.
So isn't kneeling to a flag a First Amendment free speech issue? And I don't like it, but I mean, isn't that a bit of a dichotomy of thought?
Absolutely. Sure. But it should not be accepted when you're representing our country and it, like, I'll say the Olympics, right? When you had a bunch of these people kneeling during the Olympics. When you are representing our country, it doesn't make it right. Just because First Amendment right to do that, it doesn't make it right. And when those lines are being blurred, the moral fabric of who we are as Americans is being blurred. I think that's a bigger issue. Because saying, okay, if my Second Amendment right is to own a gun or whatever, and then I go and shoot somebody, like, isn't that practicing your Second Amendment right? No, that doesn't make it right.
So in my head, and I agree with everything you just said, doesn't this become more of a moral, cultural, uh, ethics issue that is maybe, education, I think, is where this stuff starts. I have a friend that is in education, school teacher, um, little kids. And at their school, they try to instill in these kids a deep sense of right and wrong. The issue though is right and wrong is something that we can interpret differently, right? Like it comes down to some code, and now it's okay to be born a boy and be on a girls swimming team or vice versa. So like, what do we accept as right and wrong? And is it government's place to, and like in this situation of uh, people kneeling for flags, is that government's place to really dictate how people should think and feel? Or is it their job to protect this environment where people are free to think and feel? That's kind of the issue I have when politics becomes muddied with, I mean, the whole purpose of government is to protect my freedom, period. Right?
Yeah.
Anything other than that becomes an infringement. Right now, we live in tyranny as far as I'm concerned. A dear friend of mine just paid his tax bill, and his tax bill was more than most people earn in 2 or 3 years. And that's disgusting. Like, that's ridiculous. And of course, he makes a good income, but like, how is it okay to tax somebody 35 or 40% of their income? Not even to mention, this guy's paying taxes on the vehicles and things like that he buys. Uh, how do we start to change the way moms and dads raise their kids? And how can a congressperson affect that?
Sure. I'll address the taxation and all of that. We are grossly overtaxed as citizens of the United States. It was never supposed to be to this level, right? When we talk about our founders and what we actually were leaving when we left the crown, it should have never gotten this bad. But why has it gotten this bad? We need to stop acting like we don't have control over this.
Mm-hmm.
So goes and pays Uncle Sam, 50, 60 grand in taxes. Well, why did we get to this point? You elected people that have passed legislation and have used your taxpayer money to go fund things. And that's why you have an increase in taxes,
Mm-hmm.
right? We elected these people. And I'm so sick of being on defense and just saying, even with the pandemic and unconstitutional lockdowns and unconstitutional mandates, why did we all just sit around and say that as if it's not in our control? We are a representative democracy. This has always been in our control. And somehow we lost control. We lost our way because we, the people, didn't stand up for it. And I think that's the biggest issue is that, let's go back to what we were talking about with your grandfather and, being a Democrat and wanting to help the poor and all of that. Well, who approved of the Great Society or all these different policy measures that now we're old enough 50 years later to see how bad those policies were?
Mm-hmm.
And then elect the same people to then push that. So then 50 years from now, we have the same thing over and over again, except on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
We have here. And the same goes for the schools. Parents should have the rights always, especially when it comes to their children. Teachers, especially the younger ones now who are notoriously more liberal, these millennials that believe more in socialism and whatnot, think that they have free reign on what to say to kids. And if nobody stands up to them, well, they're going to keep doing it, right? My teachers growing up, we didn't know if they were Democrat or Republican. We kind of thought maybe some of them would be Democrat, but they always respected the flag. They had fathers who had fought in World War II. They cared about our American values, and they weren't trying to indoctrinate kids on anti-American Marxist ideology, which is what the younger teachers now are pushing in our public school systems.
Mm-hmm.
The parents have the right. You don't like this, take your child out of school. You don't like that? Run for school board. Go and show up to the school board meetings and actually take action with the capacity that you can and fight back. Because I am tired of living in this country that somehow we don't have the power anymore to change our circumstances. That is wrong. We are a representative democracy. This is for the people, by the people. So it is up to us to elect people who we actually will represent our values in Washington, but also there. We don't even have a lot of, like, when you look at the data, the amount of people who are even like registered to vote compared to population is still pretty low. Like, we need to get there. I honestly think that over the last 2 years, all of this stuff, the chaos that happened in the political world and in the country in general, actually forced a lot of people to wake up and care. A lot of moms and parents that I see on the ground, they never knew what their kids were being taught until their kids were forced to stay home from school, and the parents were now monitoring what they were learning. That not happened, they would have had no idea. Well, if you are a parent, you should know what your kid is being taught.
Yeah. And I think that's a big issue. We, both sides, all sides, nobody that I know is happy with the state of affairs. Yet everybody keeps looking to somebody else to do something. And that's the disconnect. If not me, as my kindergarten teacher friend tells her, however old you are, 5, 6 years old in kindergarten, if not you, then who? Who will do it for you? And so I think that's the part that's missing. I mean, you're doing it. I think that's a good thing. But I think too often people, as you stated, have lost or never had the knowledge or the belief in themselves that they can do something. We just like assume that everything's too big. It's out. School board isn't a big deal, but it is a big deal if you feel like you're going hat in hand to, dear sirs, can I please talk to you about my children? Like if you feel like you're somehow below or beneath these people. Whereas I look at every level of government, from my local police chief to the president, as they work for me in a respectful way. But none of these mother effers are a dime better than I am, or you, or anybody else. These are just human beings on my payroll.
Yeah, they are. And unfortunately, a lot of people forget that. Your government, they're supposed to be servants of the people, right? Like, they work for you. Members of Congress make close to $200,000 a year. To what? Like, what are you doing? We just went to our the congressman who we will be up against come July primaries, wasn't even in his office. Like, both of his offices were shut down for how many months? And this guy is making close to $200,000 a year on your taxpayer money to literally have his offices closed, and no one knows where he is. Nobody holds him accountable. Why would a Democrat vote for him again?
So will you lobby to reduce pay for Congress people?
Absolutely.
What do you think a congressperson should be paid? Just to make up a number. No, don't, because somebody will pull this up later when you sign off on them to get $350 a year.
Right. Term limits.
Term limits? We do have term limits. Every time an election comes up, there's a term limit.
Yeah, but going back to people needing to care more and register to vote and be a part of the political process, until that happens, we need term limits.
So isn't that social engineering in itself? The citizens are too lazy or apathetic or stupid to do what they're supposed to do. So, I mean, that's why the government is what it is, because that's why we have all the gun laws we do, because people are not safe with guns. That's why we have all the driving laws we do, because people aren't safe behind the wheel. That's why we even have law. Go ahead.
You're comparing apples to oranges. I don't.
Am I though?
Yes, I know. The public should. Government wants you to believe that the general public and that you are stupid and that there is a role for them, which is why they keep implementing policies to try to take care of everybody because that's how they hold on to their power. That was the social engineering, was that we needed this big gargantuan government to save us in the first place. That was, people are smart. They are enterprising. This is human nature. And that's what our founders, when they created our documents, they knew human nature and they wanted to encourage people to get involved in this political process so that they didn't have a king or a tyrannical government telling them what to do, because they believed in the power of the person, right? The social engineering happened when government became too big and gave themselves more power. And then the people started, I don't know. I will just say more people need to care. More people are caring. And, we're seeing a huge, when you look at data and the polls, we're actually seeing a ton of independents and a lot of moderate Democrats now coming onto the Republican Party because they care, because they believe that the Republican Party is the only party that is preserving their individual liberties. It cares about a free enterprise system. It cares about things like immigration reform and what's right and wrong from a cultural perspective. That is actually pushing people onto our side because we are the ones with the common sense nowadays.
Well, you're getting fired up now.
Yeah, don't get me started.
How do you feel about guns, gun control, gun rights, concealed carry, constitutional carry? Talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, coming from Illinois, where it is horrible. I mean, things even like FOID cards are an infringement. All of these gun control policies only impact the law-abiding citizen American, right? A criminal is going to get a gun. If they want to commit a crime, they will do whatever it takes to get their hands on something and commit that crime, right? That is, again, human nature. And I think we're always constantly on defense on this subject. Think about all the people, all the types of gun crimes that have happened that actually were kept from happening because somebody had a firearm with them or were concealing, or had a concealed carry, or were actually were practicing their right. I would love to know all the gun crime in Chicago, how many other people were able to defend themselves and actually thwart a lot of those instances. Our state is a terrible example of this. As you know, we have the largest crime. Chirac has a name for a reason and still has so many of those gun laws. And that's an example in itself of that more gun control actually doesn't work. We need to empower citizens on their Second Amendment rights. There's actually a lot of studies of people going into inner cities and actually teaching people how to exercise their Second Amendment right. And I'd love to know just how much that is actually helping the inner city communities in thwarting gun violence. And
I have a friend, Rhonda Ezel, that's what she does.
We need more of that and less of these over regulations on gun control. Again, going back to all the federal legislation, hundreds of already policies on gun regulation, and then you add it from a state perspective. And yet we still have all this violence happening. It's the person, it's not the gun.
Sure.
And we need to arm our citizens and actually change the narrative surrounding guns, especially as a female. I think it's incredibly important for women to know how to exercise their Second Amendment, how to shoot a gun, gun safety. That needs to be taught even at a young age. I was blessed my father made sure I knew how to shoot a gun when I was a kid, practiced gun safety as a kid. I was around those types of people who understood guns, and it was a natural, it wasn't foreign to me, right?
Sure.
Where there's such a negative connotation when it comes to guns.
Would you support a state initiative? I know as a congressperson, you don't have legislative power in Illinois, but would you support an initiative to repeal the FOID card?
Yes.
Yeah. Would you support an initiative for constitutional carry in Illinois?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you support an initiative as a congressperson for some type of nationwide legislation for reciprocity for concealed carry. Some people
Yes.
say we already have that. It's called the Second Amendment, but because of the patchwork of laws, it's quite muddy.
Oh, right. Well, yes.
Okay.
I mean, look at, unfortunately, it all goes back to rhetoric, right? And it all goes back to culturally how things are framed. Whenever an unfortunate situation happens, like a school shooting, it's obviously devastating. Nobody has disagreed with that, right? Nobody. But to use that to push an agenda against guns. Imagine if we had more security guards in schools. Imagine if we encouraged our teachers how to use a firearm, if we encouraged somebody to in any of these vulnerable places. Why do people go there? Why is somebody going to commit a crime? Because these places are vulnerable. They know that they're not going to get shot at, so they're going to go and commit that crime, right?
It's also horrific. It creates a huge impact to the public. And yeah, these people are oftentimes trying to hurt as many people as possible.
Right. And they manipulate narrative so much on people who want to push against guns to actually look at guns as evil when we're not looking at the person who committed the crime as the evil. That's what needs to be changed.
Yeah. Kind of another one of those cultural things is comes down to how we're teaching and training our kids. What's your thoughts on things like marijuana? I'm just asking because it's become so prevalent these days. Like it's like federally illegal. So many states have kind of decided no longer to enforce federal legislation or federal laws.
Yeah, I think there's an obvious need for reform on that when you're looking at people going to jail for crimes like that, when there are other things that are a lot more higher crimes, I guess, that
Sure.
need to be. I think there's been a lot of legislation that has been changed. Look at, I can't remember the woman's name. It'll come to me in a second, but who was incarcerated for Alice, her name was Alice, was incarcerated a long sentence over what would be a petty crime with marijuana. That is being changed and has been reformed under President Trump. Actually was able to do a lot of that stuff. You look at the First Step Act, things like that. I believe that is a good thing. We're going in the right direction on that. In terms of on a state perspective, I think here in Illinois, for example, like it all comes down to the townships, and it's becoming more local, which is, I think most policies should be more from a state and local perspective. If you have moms who are lobbying against a dispensary because they don't want it in their little township, then everything should become local in that way, right? I don't think the federal government should have this big control over things like marijuana. I think we can get into like other health things like medical marijuana. I think all of that is good. And I disagree with the regulation or the FDA or people who are trying to push against things like medical marijuana, especially when there's a lot of research that has come out at the benefits for it. Things like that. I think we're heading in a good direction, but overall, it's unfortunately, it's like not a huge federal issue. It should be always at a state and local perspective.
I dig that. And that's what our founders had intended. Our federal government is so bloated that it's almost too much to even take in.
Right. It's gotten way too big.
So if you go to Congress, when you leave and however many years you want to stay there, 4, 8, 20, whatever, 2, when you are, what's that?
Definitely not 20.
I'm just kidding. So you finish, you go back to your life, raise a family, whatever it is you're going to do when you're done. What standard or metrics will you have to look back and say you were successful? What will be some milestones or marking points on a career while in Congress that you will be able to reflect and say, okay, I did what I wanted to do?
Sure. So I think there are a lot of passions of mine from what I've heard from the people on the ground of what they want particularly changed. That would be, I would feel a sense of accomplishment having known that I was a part of things like that. For example, just the need for such a revamp for our veterans, the bureaucracy that's involved in the healthcare space. That's a particular passion of mine that if I were able to pass some sort of legislation or even help revamp or put a different, maybe modernized legislation for that particular area, I would know that I did a good job to be able to spearhead things like that. That's just one of many different things. Very passionate about small business and startups. If I was able to modernize legislation to, or even push back, take back legislation that has been passed.
Repeal stuff. Sure. Yeah.
So, repeal, that would be very important for me.
What kind of
and then,
stuff would you like to see repealed?
well, now that Elon Musk bought Twitter, we'll see what is actually going to happen with all of that. But Section 230, for example, is an area that really needed to be modernized. The last time it was.
Talk about what that is for a second, because I don't know, and I'm sure other people don't either.
To put it in the most like kind of easiest way, Section 230 is what has allowed Twitter to basically censor conservatives and this big bias that has been happening. The argument was always that they were a private company, so they were able to kick off and censor and do whatever they wanted.
Sure.
Protected by this particular clause, because that particular clause, it was created in the 1930s and it was revamped, I believe, in the 60s and the 80s. It was to protect actually businesses from the government. So now you have it on the other side where Twitter became so huge and basically created a monopoly in this space. And it actually needed to then be controlled in a way by the government. So something like Section 230 reform is something that conservatives could have done and could have done when we had the majority, and definitely could have done when we take back the House. Now things are a little different. It still needs to be reformed. Just because somebody bought Twitter doesn't mean that they might not do the same thing. We don't know that. It needs to be reformed, but that particular provision has been ignored for a long time. If I were to have a part in being able to modernize that piece of legislation, I know that I have left knowing that I defended First Amendment rights to all Americans. And it doesn't matter Republican or Democrat, everybody should care on things like that on Twitter. How is it that the Ayatollah of Iran is able to operate and tweet and do nefarious things through Twitter, but the president of the United States gets kicked off? These things are far more than just Republican or Democrat. So that would have been an area that I would love to be a part of. Because I think that's important, and I think it's important for future generations. We need to get that solved now and modernize there's so many different pieces of legislation like that across the board that need to be modernized to fit 2022 and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Things like, when you even look at the ERA, like the women's movement and all this stuff. Well, a lot of this stuff was put in back in the 30s, or even, labor reform. That was after the Industrial Revolution. And like, we are continuing to live off of policies that were implemented 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Ridiculous to me.
Mm-hmm.
Purpose of having new faces and new perspective, which is what our founders wanted. They warned against people who would be entrenched there for 30, 40 years. They wanted new people all the time. That's why they put an election every 2 years, because they had to fit the culture and the modern times to be able to continue on a republic. Mm-hmm. We have people 40 years and reform has never happened. Of course it hasn't, because they're living back in the 70s still, when we have policies that are still controlling us today that just don't fit.
Makes sense. You've done a good job raising money on this campaign. What's the biggest hurdles in front of you before June, which is the election for those of you listening?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is just mobilizing our primary voters. You know, a lot of people feel disenfranchised from the last 2 years, which is totally warranted. We've seen a lot of different chaos and things like that that have kind of made people really question our republic, our representative and the way we do things, which is totally warranted. But we need people to know that their vote matters, their vote counts, and they need to get out and vote. Candidates like myself need the help. We need the volunteers. We need the resources. We need to be able to get over that finish line to be able to go on to the general and defeat the incumbent. And that only happens if enough people care and want to mobilize and then want to then subsequently be a part of using their rights as a citizen of the United States by actually voting. You know, just to give you an example, in Georgia, for example, when we lost the Senate races, yeah, Democrats did a lot. They were registering voters, new voters. They were mobilizing their people. They had a lot of money, but we had 500,000 Republicans stay home. They didn't even vote. Things like that are important, and we cannot allow the other side to make us believe that we don't have a voice in this fight, because that is not true. So people need to care, and they need to get out and vote, and they need to help candidates across the country do that too.
So how do people listening to the Higher Line here today help you? How can they connect? How can they help? Of course, people that are not in your district can't vote for you, but how can they help you?
CatalinaForCongress.com is where you can find us. Sign up to volunteer if you're in the area. If you're not in the area, sign up to Phone Bank. Contribute if you can, but you know, most of all, or share if you have, you know, friends in Illinois or in this district in particular. But also thank you for listening, and for, you know, just by listening to candidates like myself, it means that you care enough to want to be involved, and that's incredibly important. You know, we need enough people. If you don't like what I had to say, you know, you have every right to go find a different candidate that you might connect with more. And that's always the power of the person, is just listening and being involved is the first step.
I like that. If people never meet you, never talk to you on the phone or cross paths with you, what would you leave them with?
You can be whatever you want to be in this country. We have the power to define our own destiny. You know, my family came from a oppressive government in Central America where they didn't even have basic rights. My family was not able to become who they are meant to be without coming to the United States and pursuing the American dream. Just the fact that we can live and breathe here in the United States is a gift in itself, and people should own that and define their own destiny and become and do whatever they want to become and do, because they have the ability and the power to do that because of freedom and what we were founded upon. And I think that's something that we need to remember always, is that you can be whoever you want to be here. Define your own destiny. That's what I would tell them.
I dig that. Well, and you're doing that for yourself right now. You've stayed the course. I know it's daunting, a daunting task going up against the entrenched candidates or the left, which has tons of resources to fight against you, but you guys have done a really good job. You've stayed the course. So kudos on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can't wait to see the outcome in June. Those of you guys that have listened, and gals, I think it's important for you to have these conversations with the people running for state, local, federal offices in your region. Call them up, get them on the phone, say, how can I help? Why should I help you? You might find out some of these people don't have the motives that their little card that they sent you in the mail says. You might find out that maybe they have some concepts and ideas that are right in line with you, like what Catalina just said. You don't know that if you just show up and vote and don't even know who's on the ballot. You ask the questions and make the phone calls. I'd leave you guys with this. Not to take the last word, but what you just said, I think, is so powerful. People can truly do whatever the heck they want to here, which for most people is mediocrity, and you can choose to rise above that and do some pretty great, amazing things. And we need more people like you, young people wanting to step into the breach, so to speak, on behalf of liberty. So I appreciate you doing that.
Thank you.
I still haven't figured out if I'm going to vote for you or not, though.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can.
What were you going to say?
I said, hopefully we can convince you between now and June. But, I think not to have the last word now either, but
you can have it.
I think people, anybody doing hard things, whether it's running for office, or which anybody can do, believe me, or, starting their own business or changing a career, whatever it means, doesn't mean that it doesn't come with these challenges and these struggles and our own, everybody has their own path and their own journey, and it's very hard. And I think the harder, the bigger you want to impact and make change for yourself or for the country or for the world, the harder of a road it is. But anybody can do it. And you just got to believe in yourself to be able to go through all that.
That's a big one. As soon as people figure out how to do that, the world opens up.
Right. And there is a power that doesn't want you to open that ability up. There is a power that wants to control you and keep you from living your destiny and your highest potential. And that's part of the whole struggle is actually going against that power.
I like it. Not the last word, but I hope you guys go check out the website, Catalina for Congress. Smicky with thehigherline.com. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. Be well. Don't be dickheads. Tell somebody that you love them.
Visit our website, carrytrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., Carry Trainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@carrytrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@carrytrainer.com or carrytrainer.com.